The boardroom on the 80th floor of Sterling Global Holdings went silent. A $320 million contract had been signed. Shareholders were waiting for the announcement. But then, Lila Carter, 14 years old, the maid's daughter, stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "That's signature. It's not yours, Mr. Sterling." The entire room froze. Edward Sterling, CEO of the empire, looked down at the contract. His heart stopped. That handwriting wasn't his. But before we continue, make sure you've subscribed to the channel and comment where you're watching this video from. We'd love to know how far our stories have traveled. Sterling Tower rose like a steel giant in the heart of the financial district, its glass facade reflecting clouds that most people would never touch. Each floor was a different world. The higher you climbed, the colder the air became. On the ground level, delivery workers shuffled in and out. By the 20th floor, junior analysts typed frantically under fluorescent lights. On the 50th, executives made calls that moved millions across borders. But the 80th floor, that was Edward Sterling's domain. Edward Sterling was 48 years old, though some days he felt twice that. He was the CEO of Sterling Global Holdings, a conglomerate that stretched across real estate empires and international finance. His signature alone could greenlight projects that reshaped cities. He was a man who had everything except time to notice the people who kept his world running. People like Grace Carter. Grace had worked in the Sterling household for 12 years. She cleaned the executive floors, replaced water pitchers during late-night meetings, polished the glass walls until they disappeared. She was invisible by design, the way all good help was supposed to be. But Grace wasn't alone. Her daughter Lila Carter was 14 years old. She had grown up in the shadow of Sterling Tower, not as a guest, but as a ghost. While other kids played in parks, Lila wandered the illuminated hallways of power, helping her mother carry supplies, wiping down tables, replacing staplers. She learned early that silence was survival. But Lila had a gift, one that no one knew about, not even her mother. She could read people through their handwriting. It started when she was 8, watching her teacher scribble notes on the board. Lila noticed how the letters leaned when the teacher was tired, how they straightened when she was confident. Over time, Lila realized that handwriting was a language of its own. A slant to the right meant urgency. A curve in the capital letters suggested warmth. A sharp, angular stroke revealed impatience or control. By the time she was 12, Lila could glance at a signature and tell you if the person was lying, conflicted, or afraid. She never told anyone. It felt too strange, too small a skill to matter in a world of billion-dollar deals. But she watched. Always watched. One night long past midnight, Lila was helping her mother clean the 80th floor boardroom. The executives had left hours ago, but Edward Sterling remained hunched over documents at the head of the table. His tie was loosened. His eyes were red. Grace moved quietly, emptying trash bins. Lila wiped down the glass tabletop, careful not to make a sound. Then Edward spoke. "Do you ever feel trapped?" Lila froze. She wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. Grace stopped moving. "Sir." Edward looked up, noticing them for the first time. He gave a tired smile. "Sorry. Long night." He glanced at Lila, then back at the papers. He picked up his pen, a black Parker fountain pen, the kind that left smooth, deliberate strokes, and signed his name at the bottom of a document. Then he set the pen down and leaned back in his chair. "A company can feel like a golden cage sometimes," he said quietly, his gaze distant. "The higher you climb, the colder it gets." Lila didn't know what to say. She just nodded. Edward looked at her for a moment longer, as if seeing her, really seeing her for the first time. Then he stood, gathered his papers, and walked toward the elevator. Grace touched Lila's shoulder. "Come on, baby. Let's finish up." But Lila stayed where she was, staring at the spot where Edward had been sitting. She thought about what he'd said. A golden cage. The higher you climb, the colder it gets. She didn't understand it then. But she would. Because 1 month later, a contract would arrive that would change everything. And Lila Carter, the invisible girl, the maid's daughter, the one nobody noticed, would be the only person in that tower who could see the lie hidden in plain sight. 1 month later, Sterling Global Holdings was preparing for the biggest deal in its history. The partner was Helios Group, an international conglomerate with reach across 3 continents. The contract was worth $320 million, a joint venture that would secure Sterling's dominance in the global market for the next decade. If everything went right, Edward Sterling would cement his legacy. If anything went wrong, the company could lose ownership of its core assets. The signing ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning. Press would be there. Shareholders. Executives from both sides. Everything had to be perfect. The night before, Grace Carter received her assignment: prepare the 80th floor boardroom for the event. She brought Lila along to help. It was late past 9 and the building was nearly empty. They worked in silence, polishing the long glass table, arranging water pitchers, straightening chairs. Lila wiped down the projector screen while her mother vacuumed the carpet. Then the elevator chimed. Grace looked up, startled. A man stepped out, tall, mid-40s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit. His expression was smooth, unreadable. Adrian Cross, Vice President of Finance. Grace straightened immediately. Mr. Cross, we're almost finished. Adrian barely glanced at her. Leave it. I need to rearrange some files. Grace hesitated. Sir, we were told to. I said leave it. His voice was cold, final. Grace nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Come on, Lila. But Lila had already noticed something. Adrian walked to the head of the table and set down a leather portfolio. He opened it, pulled out a stack of documents and placed them carefully on the table. Lila's eyes caught the logo on the cover page. Helios Holdings, not Helios Group. It was a small difference. Tiny, really. But Lila had seen the name Helios Group printed on banners in the hallway all week. She'd seen it on the press release draft her mother had accidentally knocked over while cleaning. This was different. She wanted to say something. But Adrian's eyes flicked toward her, sharp and dismissive. Let's go, Lila, Grace whispered, tugging her arm. They left. The next morning, the boardroom was filled with people. Executives in designer suits, lawyers with briefcases, photographers adjusting their lenses. The air buzzed with anticipation. Edward Sterling stood at the head of the table, composed and confident. Across from him sat the representatives from Helios Group, 3 men in dark suits, their expressions calm and professional. Adrian Cross stood to Edward's right, holding the contract in a leather folder. The ceremony began. Speeches were made. Smiles exchanged. Cameras flashed. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Adrian placed the contract in front of Edward. Edward picked up his black Parker fountain pen, the one he always used for important signings. He scanned the final page briefly, then signed his name at the bottom with smooth, deliberate strokes. The room erupted in applause. Champagne was poured. Handshakes went around. The Helios representatives smiled and nodded. Edward smiled back, relieved. It was done. Outside the glass walls of the boardroom, barely visible in the hallway, Lila stood with her mother. They had been told to stay nearby in case anything needed to be cleaned up afterward. Lila watched through the glass as the celebration continued. Confetti cannons went off. People laughed. Edward raised a glass. But something gnawed at Lila. She couldn't stop thinking about last night. About Adrian Cross. About the portfolio he'd placed on the table. About the logo, Helios Holdings. She wanted to believe it was nothing. A typo. A backup document. Maybe she'd remembered it wrong. But she hadn't. She knew what she'd seen. And then as the crowd began to disperse, Lila noticed something else. Adrian Cross wasn't celebrating. He stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching Edward with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't the smile of someone who had just closed a successful deal. It was the smile of someone who had just gotten away with something. Lila's stomach tightened. Grace touched her shoulder. Come on, baby. Let's start cleaning up. But Lila didn't move. She kept watching Adrian. And Adrian for just a moment glanced toward the hallway toward her. Their eyes met. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look concerned. He looked amused. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Lila's hands clenched into fists. Something was wrong. She didn't know what yet. But she knew with absolute certainty that the contract everyone was celebrating, the one Edward Sterling had just signed, was not what it seemed. And no one else had noticed. No one except her. An hour later, the boardroom was empty. The champagne glasses had been collected. The confetti swept into bins. The executives had moved to a private lounge on the 75th floor to continue celebrating. Grace and Lila were left to finish the cleanup. Grace wiped down the table while Lila gathered stray papers from beneath the chairs. Most of them were blank agendas, discarded notes, crumpled napkins. Then under the far end of the table, Lila saw it. A document. Face down. She picked it up, flipped it over, and froze. It was the contract, not a copy. The original. The final page, the one with the signatures. She shouldn't have it. This should have been locked away immediately after the signing. But somehow in the chaos of celebration, it had been dropped. Forgotten. Lila's eyes moved to the bottom of the page. Edward Sterling's signature. At first glance, it looked fine. Confident. Flowing. But Lila had seen Edward sign documents before. She had watched him that late night a month ago, hunched over papers, signing with his black Parker fountain pen. She knew his handwriting. And this wasn't it. Her pulse quickened. She looked closer. The slant was wrong. Edward's signature always leaned slightly to the left, a subtle tilt that showed control. This one leaned to the right, as if written in a hurry. The capital S in Sterling was incomplete. Edward always closed the loop at the top, a habit so consistent that Lila had noticed it every single time. This S was open the curve unfinished. And the ink. It was lighter, thinner. Edward always used a black Parker fountain pen with deep, rich ink that left bold, deliberate strokes. This ink was faint, inconsistent, the kind left by a cheap ballpoint pen. Lila's hands trembled as she held the paper. This wasn't Edward's signature. Someone had forged it. She turned toward her mother, who was spraying cleaner on the glass wall. "Mom." Grace didn't look up. "Almost done, baby. Just a few more minutes." "Mom, look at this." Something in Lila's voice made Grace stop. She turned, saw the expression on her daughter's face, and walked over quickly. "What is it?" Lila held up the contract. "This is Mr. Sterling's signature, right?" Grace glanced at it. "Yes. Why?" "It's not his." Grace blinked. "What are you talking about?" "Look." Lila pointed to the signature. "The slant is wrong. The S isn't closed. And the ink, he always uses a fountain pen. This is ballpoint." Grace stared at the paper, then at Lila. "Lila, you can't just—" "I'm not making this up, Mom. I've seen him sign things before. I know his handwriting." Grace's face went pale. She looked around nervously as if someone might be listening. "Lila, stop. You need to put that back right now." "But, no." Grace's voice was sharp, urgent. "You don't understand what you're saying. If you're wrong, we could lose everything. Our jobs. Our home. Everything. I'm not wrong." "You're 14 years old," Grace's voice cracked. "You can't accuse people of forgery. That's serious, Lila. That's dangerous." Lila looked at her mother, and for the first time she understood something. Her mother was afraid. Not because she didn't believe her, but because she did. Grace had spent 12 years being invisible, 12 years keeping her head down, doing her job, never asking questions. That was how you survived in a place like this. You didn't speak up. You didn't make waves. You stayed quiet. But Lila couldn't. She looked down at the contract again, at the forged signature, at the lie that no one else had seen. "Mom," she said quietly, "if someone tricked Mr. Sterling into signing something that isn't real, doesn't he deserve to know?" Grace's hands were shaking. "Lila, please, just put it back. We'll forget we ever saw it." "What if he loses everything because no one told him the truth?" Grace closed her eyes. "It's not our place." "Then whose place is it?" Silence. Lila stepped closer. "You've worked here for 12 years. You've cleaned his office. You've seen him late at night when everyone else is gone. You've watched him work harder than anyone I've ever known." Her voice softened. "He deserves the truth, Mom. Even if it scares us." Grace looked at her daughter. Really looked at her, and saw something she hadn't noticed before. Lila wasn't a child anymore. She was brave in a way Grace had forgotten how to be. Grace exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging. If we do this, if we tell him, we could lose everything. I know. And you still want to? Lila nodded. He's worth telling the truth for. Grace stood there for a long moment, staring at the contract in her daughter's hands. Then she nodded. Okay, she whispered. Okay, but we do this carefully. We go to him directly. No one else. Lila felt a surge of relief. Thank you, Mom. Grace managed a weak smile, though her hands were still trembling. You're braver than I ever was, baby. Lila folded the contract carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Tomorrow she would find Edward Sterling, and she would tell him the truth, even if it cost her everything. The next morning, Lila waited. She knew Edward Sterling's routine. Every day at 7:45 he arrived at the building through the private entrance on the east side. He took his personal elevator straight to the 80th floor alone. That was her window. Grace had tried to stop her one last time before they left the apartment. Lila, we can still turn back. We can pretend we never saw anything. But Lila had already made up her mind. She stood near the elevator bank on the ground floor, clutching the folded contract inside her jacket pocket. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. At 7:43, the glass doors opened. Edward Sterling walked in dressed in a navy suit, his expression calm and focused. He moved like a man who had just secured the deal of a lifetime, confident, unburdened. Lila's stomach twisted. He didn't know. He had no idea what he'd signed. Edward headed toward his private elevator. Lila took a breath and stepped forward. Mr. Sterling. He stopped, glanced over his shoulder. His brow furrowed slightly. Yes. Lila's throat felt tight. I need to show you something, please. Edward looked at her more carefully, now recognition dawning. You're Grace's daughter, right? Yes, sir, Lila. He checked his watch. I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Can this wait? No, sir. It can't. Something in her voice made him pause. He studied her face, saw the tension there, the fear she was trying to hide. He nodded slowly. All right. Come with me. They stepped into the elevator together. The doors closed. The space suddenly felt impossibly small. Edward pressed the button for the 80th floor, then turned to her. What's this about? Lila pulled the contract from her pocket and held it out with trembling hands. This. Edward took it, unfolded it, and glanced at the page. This is the Helios contract. Where did you get this? It was left behind yesterday, after the signing. Edward's expression hardened. You shouldn't have this. This is confidential. I know, sir. But I need you to look at the signature. My signature? Yes. Edward looked down at the page, his jaw tightening. I signed this yesterday in front of 50 people. What's your point? Lila forced herself to meet his eyes. That signature, it's not yours. The elevator went silent. Edward stared at her. Excuse me. It's not your handwriting, Mr. Sterling. His expression shifted confusion, then irritation. That's a serious accusation. I know, sir. But I've seen you sign documents before. I've watched you. And this isn't how you write. Edward let out a short, dry laugh. You're telling me you can identify handwriting? You're what, 14? Yes, sir. And you think you know my signature better than I do? Lila didn't flinch. The slant is wrong. You always lean slightly left when you sign. This leans right. Edward's smile faded. The capital S in Sterling. Lila continued, her voice steady now. You always close the loop at the top. It's something you do every time. But this one, look, the S is split in the middle. It's not connected. Edward looked down at the contract again, slower this time. His fingers tightened on the paper. And the ink, Lila added quietly. You use a black Parker fountain pen. The ink is always thick, bold. This is thinner, lighter, like it was written with a cheap ballpoint. Edward's breathing slowed. He brought the contract closer to his face, tilting it under the elevator's overhead light. The slant, the open S, the faint ink. His heart began to race. She was right. The elevator chimed. 80th floor. The doors opened, but Edward didn't move. He stood frozen, staring at the signature that wasn't his. "Wait here," he said, his voice tight. He stepped out into the hallway and walked quickly toward his office. Lila followed, unsure if she was supposed to, but unable to stop herself. Edward unlocked his office door and went straight to his desk. He pulled open a drawer and took out a file, previous contracts documents he'd signed over the past year. He laid them side by side with the Helios contract, and there it was, the difference. Every other signature had the same leftward slant, the same closed S, the same bold black ink. But this one, the one from yesterday, was different. Edward's face went pale. "How did I not see this?" Lila stayed by the door, silent. Edward picked up his phone and pressed a button. "Security. I need you to pull the original contract file from yesterday's signing, immediately. Bring it to my office." He hung up and turned to Lila. His expression had changed completely. The irritation was gone. Now there was something else. Fear, anger, and something that looked almost like gratitude. "If you're right about this," he said quietly. "Someone switched the contract. Someone forged my signature." Lila nodded. "Yes, sir." "Do you know who—" She hesitated. "I saw someone the night before, in the boardroom. He was rearranging documents." "Who?" "Mr. Cross. Adrian Cross." Edward's jaw clenched. "Adrian." A knock came at the door. A security officer entered, holding a leather folder. "The original file, sir." Edward took it, opened it, and pulled out the final page of the contract. He compared it to the one Lila had found. They were different. The version Edward had signed in front of everyone, captured on camera, witnessed by 50 people, had been real. But sometime after the signing, it had been replaced with a forgery. Edward sank into his chair, his hands shaking. If this contract had gone through without anyone noticing, we would have signed over asset rights to a shell company. We would have lost control of Sterling Global. He looked up at Lila. His eyes filled with something she'd never seen before in a man like him. Vulnerability. "You just saved this company," he said quietly. "You just saved everything." Lila didn't know what to say. She just nodded. Edward walked over to her and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth." Within 2 hours, Edward Sterling had assembled a private team, his head of security, his legal counsel, and a forensic document analyst. The boardroom on the 80th floor became a war room. Documents were spread across the table. Security footage was pulled from the night before the signing. Phone records were subpoenaed, and every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. Adrian Cross. The document analyst confirmed what Lila had seen with her eyes alone. The signature on the replacement contract was a forgery. The slant, the stroke pressure, the ink composition, all of it was wrong. But the real revelation came when they traced the origin of the fake contract itself. It hadn't come from Helios Group. It had come from Helios Holdings, a shell company registered 3 months earlier in the Cayman Islands. And the sole shareholder, Adrian Cross. Edward stood at the head of the table, his face carved from stone. "He created a fake company. He forged my signature. He planned to transfer asset ownership rights to himself." The lawyer nodded grimly. "If this contract had gone through unchallenged, Sterling Global would have effectively signed over controlling interest in your East Coast properties. We're talking about nearly $2 billion in assets." Edward's hands clenched into fists. "Where is he now?" "In his office. He doesn't know we found out." Edward's eyes darkened. "Bring him here." 10 minutes later, Adrian Cross walked into the boardroom, calm and composed. He was dressed impeccably, as always, tailored suit, polished shoes, not a hair out of place. He smiled when he saw Edward. "You wanted to see me." Edward didn't smile back. "Sit down." Adrian's smile faltered slightly, but he obeyed, taking a seat across the table. Edward slid the forged contract toward him. "Recognize this?" Adrian glanced at it. "Of course." The Helios deal. Congratulations again, by the way. It's a huge win for the company. Is it? Adrian's eyes flicked up. I'm sorry. Edward leaned forward. Tell me, Adrian, how long have you been planning this? The room went silent. Adrian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Planning what? The forgery, the shell company, the theft. For a moment, Adrian said nothing. Then he laughed a cold, hollow sound. I don't know what you're talking about. Edward placed another document on the table. Helios Holdings. Registered in the Cayman Islands. Sole shareholder Adrian Cross. Adrian's smile vanished. You created a fake company. Edward continued, his voice steady and lethal. You forged my signature. You switched the contract after the signing. And you almost got away with it. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. That's a fascinating story. Do you have proof? Security footage, forensic analysis, financial records, and a witness. Adrian's gaze sharpened. A witness. Edward gestured toward the door. Come in. The door opened, and Lila stepped inside, her mother close behind her. Adrian's eyes landed on Lila, and for the first time his composure cracked. He stared at her in disbelief. You're trusting a child. Edward's voice was ice. That child noticed what 50 executives missed. She saw the signature was fake. She had the courage to tell me the truth. Adrian's face twisted into something uglier now. You're going to destroy everything we've built because a maid's daughter thinks she can read handwriting. No, Edward said quietly. I'm going to destroy you because you tried to steal my company. Adrian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You have no idea what you're doing. I've given 12 years to this company. I've made you billions, and you're going to believe some kid over me. Edward stood as well, matching his gaze. You're right. You've been here 12 years, and in all that time I trusted you. I gave you access, authority, respect. His voice dropped. And you used it to betray me. Adrian's jaw clenched. This is insane. Security footage shows you entering the boardroom at 11:47 p.m. the night before the signing. You were alone. You had access to the contract. You switched it. You can't prove that. The forensic analyst already matched the ink and paper stock to a printer in your office. Adrian's face paled. Edward stepped closer. You were willing to destroy thousands of jobs, dismantle decades of work, and steal from the people who trusted you. For what money? Adrian's expression hardened. You don't understand what it's like to work in someone's shadow for years, to watch them take all the credit while you do all the work. So you thought you deserved to take it from me. I thought I deserved to be you. The door opened again. 2 police officers stepped inside. Adrian's eyes widened. Wait. Adrian Cross. One of the officers said, You're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and attempted grand larceny. They moved toward him. Adrian backed away, his voice rising. This is a mistake. You're making a mistake. But the officers didn't stop. They cuffed his hands behind his back. As they led him toward the door, Adrian turned back one last time, his face twisted with bitterness. All this, because of a kid, a maid's daughter. Edward looked at Lila, then back at Adrian. No, he said quietly. All this because she saw something you never could. Adrian sneered. And what's that? Edward's voice was calm, final. The line between right and wrong. The officers led Adrian Cross out of the room. The door closed behind them. And for the first time in days, Edward Sterling exhaled. 2 days after Adrian Cross was arrested, Grace Carter walked into Edward Sterling's office with her resignation letter. Her hands were shaking as she placed the envelope on his desk. Edward looked up from his computer. What's this? My resignation, sir. Edward frowned. Why? Grace kept her eyes down. I think it's best. After everything that happened, people will talk. It's better if Lila and I just... Grace. Edward's voice was firm, but not unkind. Sit down. She hesitated, then sat. Edward leaned back in his chair, studying her. You think you need to leave because your daughter exposed a criminal in my company. I think we caused a lot of trouble, sir. Trouble. Edward shook his head. Grace, your daughter, saved this company from collapse. She prevented a theft that would have destroyed thousands of jobs. She did what no one else had the courage or the skill to do. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She's just a child. She's extraordinary. Edward opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. He slid it across the desk toward Grace. What is this? She asked. A scholarship. Full tuition to the Ashford Academy for Forensic Arts and Document Analysis. Grace opened the folder, her hands trembling. Inside was a letter of acceptance, a tuition waiver, and a personal recommendation signed by Edward Sterling himself. I don't understand, she whispered. Your daughter has a gift, Edward said. She sees things other people miss. She reads truth in handwriting and details in patterns. That's not something you ignore. That's something you nurture. Grace looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. Sir, we can't afford. You don't have to. It's covered. Everything. Tuition, books, housing if she needs it. Grace couldn't speak. She just stared at the letter in her hands. Edward stood and walked around the desk. You don't need to leave, Grace. You've worked here for 12 years with integrity and dedication. This is your home as much as it is mine. Grace wiped her eyes and nodded, barely able to breathe. Thank you, sir. Thank you. The following week, Edward Sterling held a press conference. The room was packed, journalists, shareholders, employees. Cameras lined the back wall. Flashes popped like fireworks. Edward stood at the podium, calm and composed. Last week, he began. Sterling Global narrowly avoided one of the most sophisticated fraud attempts in corporate history. A senior executive forged my signature and attempted to transfer billions in assets to a shell company. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. But we're standing here today because one person saw what everyone else missed. He paused, then gestured toward the side of the stage. Lila Carter, please come up. Lila stepped onto the stage, her mother beside her. She looked terrified, but she walked forward anyway. Edward smiled at her, then turned back to the microphone. Lila is 14 years old. She's the daughter of one of our most dedicated employees. And she noticed something no executive, no lawyer, no analyst caught. He looked directly at the cameras. She looked at a contract and said 5 words that changed everything. That signature isn't yours. The room fell silent. Because of her courage, because of her honesty, because she refused to stay silent when something was wrong, we're still here. This company is still here. Edward turned to Lila. Thank you. The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Journalists scribbled notes. Employees stood and clapped. Lila stood frozen, overwhelmed, her eyes wide. Grace squeezed her hand gently. And for the first time in her life, Lila Carter, the invisible girl, the maid's daughter, was seen. Not as someone small, not as someone powerless, but as someone who had changed everything. Episode 7, 1 year later, 400 words. 1 year later, Lila Carter sat in a small office on the 7th floor of the National Institute for Document Verification. She was 16 now, an intern working alongside forensic analysts and legal experts who examined signatures, contracts, and evidence for court cases across the country. Her desk was simple: a lamp, a magnifying glass, a stack of case files, and on the corner in a silver frame was a photograph. It was the forged contract, the one that had started everything, the signature that wasn't Edward Sterling's. Beneath the frame, written in neat purple ink, was a single line: "Truth has a handwriting too." Lila looked at it often. It reminded her of where she'd come from, of the night she'd stood in that elevator, terrified but determined, of the moment she'd chosen courage over silence. That night she wrote a letter to her mother. "Dear Mom, I hope you're doing well. I miss you every day. Work has been incredible. Today, I analyzed a signature on a will that 3 different lawyers said was legitimate. But I could see it, the hesitation in the strokes, the uneven pressure, the way the letters didn't flow naturally. It was forged. The family almost lost everything because no one looked closely enough. But we caught it. Every day here I see people trying to hide the truth. Forging signatures. Altering documents. Pretending to be someone they're not. But I also see people like you, Mom. People who work quietly, honestly, without expecting recognition. People who choose integrity even when no one's watching. You taught me that truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it. I'll be home next month for the holidays. I can't wait to see you. Love always, Lila. She sealed the letter, placed it in an envelope, and set it aside. Then she turned back to her desk, picked up her magnifying glass, and opened the next case file. Because the work wasn't finished. There were still lies to uncover. Still truths waiting to be seen. And Lila Carter, no longer invisible, no longer powerless, was ready. She glanced once more at the framed contract on her desk, at the forged signature that had changed her life. And she smiled. Because truth, she had learned, always leaves a mark. You just have to know where to look. Lila Carter's story reminds us that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It only needs someone brave enough to point out what's wrong. In a world of power and contracts, the most valuable thing isn't a signature, it's trust. A child may not have status or authority, but with honest eyes and a courageous heart, they can save an empire. When we choose truth over silence, when we speak up, even when we're afraid, we become more powerful than we ever imagined. Lila didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait to be older, more qualified, or more important. She simply saw the truth and refused to look away. If you believe that truth, no matter how small, is the foundation of everything great, comment below, I choose truth. And don't forget to subscribe to Maid's Daughter Stories so you never miss a story where courage meets kindness.